So, good evening, everyone. Most people know me, but I'm Jenny Stewart, President of Humanists Victoria. And as humanists, we acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners of this land. We acknowledge that First Nations people have cared for country and lived sustainably for millennia and have much to teach us. We pay our respects to First Nations elders, past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. And as we're doing this online, I'll just invite everyone to make a private acknowledgement of the land that they're tuning in from. Steve and I are on Wurundjeri country, but you may very well be somewhere else. So the topic for tonight's talk is, what is humanism and why it matters? And we have had a couple of other talks on this topic this year. Robert Bender, who's online, gave one. Les gave one, although I think that was last year. And Ros Ive gave one. And so people who speak about this come from slightly different positions about it. And Akiva has his own, very definitely. He's laughing, but I'm not quite sure what that means. Anyhow, just to tell you a little bit about Akiva, his background is that he's studied computer science as well as philosophy and sociology, where he gained an MA. His particular interests are ethics, moral and political philosophy, especially considering the questions of how we should live and what is a good life, and what is the meaning in life, looking for meaning in life. He describes himself as an existentialist and a humanist. He coordinates Philosophers Bazaar and says that while he embraces his Jewish tradition, the universal principles of equal dignity and respect for all people, which humanism and secularism offer, are what he fully endorses. So I think, without saying more, Akiva, I'll invite you to address us, please.
Thank you, Jenny, for the invitation. And I must say I really enjoy and appreciate the opportunity to clarify my thoughts. So my little giggle before is on two accounts. Well, firstly, Jenny has seen the slides, so you may have your view as to whether my particular perspective is slightly different. And also, as often happens in preparing thoughts, whether simply to talk to a friend or to present to a number of friends, near and far, one does clarify one's own thinking. So it really is a learning opportunity, hopefully for you as well. It's certainly been one already for me. So as we want to leave time for questions, I'll get straight on to presenting some material. I trust that everyone can see some slides. There's a picture there of Australia. I didn't bother to highlight Victoria. Those of us who live in Victoria knows where it is. So humanism and why it matters. So as the title suggests, it's really a presentation in two parts. I'll try to borrow from various humanist organizations in terms of definitions, explanations of what humanism is, and also offer you my own sort of interpretation of the movement, the body of thought, the philosophy. We'll discuss what humanism is, and then I will address sort of in the second part why humanism matters in my view, and I'm sure in your view as well, deeply. So again, thank you to Humanist Victoria for the invitation, and let us dive into what is humanism. So these are extracts from longer definitions. Each of these organizations have pages of very thoughtful comments on what humanism is. Are you a humanist? Always good to do one of those quizzes. I guess we'd all pass with flight. So from the Humanist International Organization, we have humanism is a rational, non-religious approach to life. Humanists strive to lead fulfilling, meaningful, and ethical lives using reason and empathy to guide them. So we've got reason, empathy, a whole lot of keywords in there. Humanist Victoria, I did write the name over there. The logo doesn't actually have the name, but I'm sure you'll all recognize the Humanist Victoria, beautiful logo. Humanism is a way of life that values human flourishing, freedom, and the pursuit of knowledge. Humanists Australia, our umbrella organization in this country, humanism is a way of life that provides meaning and fulfillment without religion.
Sorry, could you just say that again, please?
Ken, I don't think you're talking to us, so if you wouldn't mind muting yourself. Oh, I've just done that. No problem. So I'll just repeat that. So humanism is a way of life that provides meaning and fulfillment without religion. So two of those definitions are explicit, as they should be, in terms of a definition of modern, implicitly secular humanism, although secular is usually not included because humanism simply stands for secular humanism. Non-religious, reason, empathy, knowledge. I think we get the picture. Some really key human values, hence the name, humanism. All right. My take in one sentence on some of the above, but maybe with my own slant as well from a philosophical, moral, political perspective. Humanism is the understanding that human beings all share common needs to survive and thrive, and deserve equal respect and fair equality of opportunity in the personal, social, and political spheres. So, equality is absolutely core, equal moral worth, and flowing from that, we have common needs in terms of surviving as sentient beings or simply as logical humans, and thriving as sentient and human individuals with the particular aspirations that we all have, which may be particular in our lives. So I've repeated some bits from above, really. Humanism is secular. It's generally atheist or agnostic. It's evidence-based, and it's naturalistic, which is another way of saying it doesn't subscribe to any supernatural positions. It's a non-religious point of view. From the Humanists UK, didn't want them to feel left out. Humanists make ethical decisions based on reason, empathy, and a concern for human beings and other sentient animals. I quite like that because it's broadening the concerns, as humanists most certainly do, not just to humans, but also to other sentient creatures, and indeed to the planet. We'll come back to environment and broader concerns a bit later. I wanted to thank actually Robert Bender, I know you're on the call, and Rosalind Ives, who Jenny mentioned, who've presented quite recently on what is humanism. And I think the presentations that they offered did a fabulous job on kind of explaining perhaps the more modern history of humanism. I wanted to take a stab at humanism, which I'm sure Robert, who's present, may agree, and Rosalind, who's not present, may also agree, in fact, has roots going back, the millennium before, the major religions, including Judaism and Christianity in that particular part of the world. So here's a quote from Shavaka, Indian philosophers. There is no heaven, no final liberation, no soul, no other world. How can this body, once dust or ashes, return? Who paints the peacocks? Who makes the cuckoos sing? There is no cause of these things except nature. So that's going back 2,600 years ago. Shavaka is referred to as a heterodox, which basically means non-orthodox body of thought. So probably modern humanists would have no squabbles with anything that the Shavaka philosophers said. They were materialists. They understood, many of us would argue correctly, that the world consists of material, and spirit or spirituality might emerge in our consciousness but doesn't exist as an entity or as a substance which is identifiable or which survives the body. Thank you, Shavaka. This list, I'm not going to read everybody on this list, but this is regarded by A.C. Grayling, who produced the list. I should point out that I added his name at the end of it. He wouldn't have been so brash as to put himself on the study curriculum for a course on humanism. But all of these individuals, starting with some well-known Chinese philosophers, Confucius and Mencius, the Greeks are in there, Epicurus and Epictetus. Our friend Joe from the States, the Stoics are in there, Marcus Aurelius and others. And we go through Islamic philosophers, Jewish philosophers like Spinoza, the classic, big hitters in the philosophical canon like Voltaire and Hume and Paine. We've got literary figures, we've got sociologists, we've got scientists, obviously, when we get to Einstein and Victor Stringer. That's an awful lot of very impressive humanists. It's a proud tradition, and as that list in the previous slide illustrate, it goes back literally, to the birth of the written word. We can't really establish how much longer it goes back because we don't have records. So a lot of fabulous legacy, probably not as many women. I'm sure there are not as many women on that list as there should be. But other than that, we've got a pretty good breadth and depth of experience and insight. Jean-Paul Sartre, I should mention, my favorite existentialist philosopher. He's also a humanist. Jenny asked me to, so I took up the challenge to explain in 3 or 4 minutes what my background is and what my path to humanism has been. So I grew up in South Africa, and that's fairly obvious, but it was also obvious to me that there was a great need to respect differences, because even if one happens to be on the side of benefiting from a system which subjugated other ethnic groups, clearly, iniquity, it was clearly unfair, it was clearly unjust, all of those words. That was one major experience, and people will be familiar enough with the legacy of apartheid South Africa to get a sense of how that pushed many people, not all South Africans clearly, but in quite a sort of liberal or progressive direction with, compassion and concern for others who were not allowed on the beaches, for example, pictured to the right there, white persons only. Net blankers is just Afrikaans for the same thing, with provincial authorities basically enforcing it. I remember growing up in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, and there was a bench literally outside the public library. One said, white persons, net blankers, and the other one said the opposite, which in South African parlance was non-white, and ni meaning not blankers, so non-whites. So that was one, legacy of growing up in South Africa. Another one for me was what I've called here Christian hegemony, basically a very strong, almost, overly powerful influence of the church in not just politics, but in cultural matters. And a lot of the judgment from apartheid, one can read the history, I think it's fairly clear, actually comes from nationalism, the National Party, but also comes from a sort of Christian fundamentalism, illustrated, for example, through the Dutch Reformed Church, which is pictured there, the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk in Afrikaans, the NGK, and their sense of unity and purpose and self-preservation, I think, is quite well known around the world. The other part of my background, as you all now know, if you didn't know before you met me this evening, is the reach of Jewish tradition and history. And I think, again, people are probably more than familiar with, the Jewish national, religious, ethnic, whatever story. And all aspects of that experience highlight the need for and the value of human equality, because the opposite of it are all too clear in terms of lack of justice, lack of support, in fact, targeting of vulnerable people, and the lack of a universal ethic when it suits certain groups of people. So that's probably clear enough. I'll just mention I've met him, I think, just the one time, but heard him speak many times. Now the chief rabbi of South Africa, Dr. Warren Goldstein, very good book. He quotes Ronald Dworkin. If you're involved in political philosophy, you'd have a pretty good idea who he is. And he's got two supervisors, both who sound like they were from the Afrikaans, speaking part of the South African community. And yet he's looking at literally Jewish law. And he, in fact, explores, for example, the vulnerability principle, which is, what he reads from the appropriate bits of the Jewish Bible, from the Torah, as required of us. So that's a humanist message right there. He gets it from texts purported to be written by the Almighty, but I think it's a very humanist conclusion that he reaches. Just an aside, really, I was born in Cape Town in 1967. So happens that year, obviously, I didn't become aware of it quite at my, 9-month passage in life, but Christian Barnard performed the first heart transplant. So the role of reason, the role of science also, which are clear humanist values, along with, compassion and an ethical stance and valuing individuals equally, certainly was part of my formative years as well. All right, so my summary of what is humanism in a few slides. We've already got a fair picture of my perspective and the organizational perspective on that from Humanist Victoria and others. Humanism is ethical, explicitly so. One should never mistreat a man or a person, no matter how one has been mistreated by him or by them. Said Plato wrote it. He put the words in the mouth of Socrates in the Socratic dialogue called the Crito. Now that's about 2,500 years ago. So again, this is the legacy of humanism. It's an ancient tradition as well as being a modern one. Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. We met Confucius before in our list of important humanists worth studying. He wrote that in the Analects about 2,500 years ago. One more interpretation of what I'm sure you will all recognize as variance on the golden rule, which is the key moral consideration as to how we treat others. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah, in other words, Jewish law, and the rest is commentary, said Hillel the elder in the Talmud, which interestingly, although the Jewish biblical texts are supposedly dated to over 2,000 years ago, the Talmud, which is the redaction or the writing down of the oral law, was only a few hundred years, basically, of the Common Era, so less than 2,000 years ago. So the Greeks and the Chinese have it over the Jews in terms of putting pen to paper on the golden rule, but hey, it's not a competition. This is the second part, moving swiftly along because I'm sure you all have comments and questions. This is the why it matters part. So really learned a lot from your presentation, Robert Bender, who's listening, and from your presentations I've heard several times, Les Allen, who's also listening, and from Rosalind Ives and other people I've heard talking. This is my attempt to, in a sense, provide 3 levels of contribution from the humanist body of thought, organizations, and indeed movement. The first, which is the individual, regards humanism as a naturalist. We spoke about that before, not supernatural. It's practical, it's secular, it's ethical, and it provides a philosophy of life or a worldview, like Stoicism, which another of our contributors, still participants today, Joe Bullock from the United States, has spoken about very effectively. This is another worldview, another philosophy of life, which really cuts the mustard. It gets the job done. It resonates. It's what human beings, myself, most definitely, I can relate to. It speaks to the individual. It engages. It stretches. It encourages, it offers all the solace and the encouragement that any good philosophy of life would want to offer. The second level is really at the sort of communal, or the small institutions, the family, communities, whatever else, that humanism establishes the bedrock for a shared social ethics for any number of open societies. Humanism would provide a fabulous bedrock for all societies, but it does require certain civic conditions. It does require ultimately some form of democratic institutions. Otherwise, unfortunately, the individual desires get snuffed out pretty quickly, unfortunately, and don't become communal shared values. The third level, and the greatest contribution in a way, but who's to say that the contribution to the individuals and to social groups and communities isn't a fabulous one already, is that humanism can provide, or does provide, the ideas, the universal values, and the social institutions. I spoke about democracy a moment ago, to support three things, I suggest: political inclusion, human rights, separate topic to discuss human rights in detail. Liz Allen and I have done that on at least one, probably more than one occasion, and also social justice. So there's a lot in that, but if you got the individual, the social, and then the political out of that slide, and we will return to this set of ideas, then I can stop talking, because you've got effectively what I wanted to say in this presentation all sorted out. So let me continue, just in case you want some more detail. Given humanist values, including freedom for the individual, equality, moral equality, not just equality of formal opportunities in a society, fairness, which does invoke the notion of equity rather than simply equality. Not everyone necessarily has the same needs. The vulnerable, disabled, many sectors in society have greater needs. So fairness actually requires that we don't simply, in all cases, treat people formally equally, but we sometimes preference people who have greater needs, and justice. So given those values, all of the rights listed, ethnic and cultural, indigenous rights, women's rights, children's rights, disability rights, workers' rights, social and economic, gender diverse and gay rights, the rights of migrants and refugees, freedom of belief and religion, and we could add more, but that kind of filled up the screen. That whole set of rights are supported, protected, promoted by humanist values held by the individual, by groups such as, Humanist Victoria, Humanists Australia, by social kind of groupings more broadly, and hopefully by societies and by political institutions to support all of those rights. So it's a pretty big deal. I don't think we had any doubts before coming along this evening that humanism matters, but how deeply and broadly it matters to everyone is perhaps the thought which I was wanting to share. I'll just go through a few fairly quick case studies. We'd be familiar with these issues in the Australian polity at the moment. Humanism matters in terms of Indigenous justice, rights, recognition, all of the above. There's been articles, reading more carefully than I might have otherwise, certain media coverage in the last few weeks. It's clear that online there's a whole lot of racist and hateful comments. There's new items on the news this evening in that regard. Since the No campaign against the Indigenous voice to Parliament began, it's misinformation, one might say, or simply putting forward a different view which doesn't regard equity the way I would and the way the major organizations in Australia from a humanist perspective have perceived the voice to Parliament being fair, practical, and unifying. the No campaign has some different views and sometimes targets the individuals unfairly or inaccurately in terms of what the claims on the Australian body politic might be by Indigenous voices trying to simply get the disadvantage experienced by that community somewhat addressed. Humanist Victoria has a lot of information on this. I read quite a bit about it separately from that as well. The Yurok Justice Commission, been all over the media in Australia the last couple of weeks, is in fact the first truth-telling commission in Australia. And among other things, it's called for Aboriginal Victorians to be put in the driver's seat of the state's criminal justice and child protection systems, seeking, a better set of outcomes in terms of the judicial system, more justice, more rights, more recognition, more consultation. So there's a lot going on there, but I think many of us will be pretty familiar with that issue. And the referendum, of course, takes place next month in Australia regarding Indigenous voice to Parliament. Minorities is a very broad category. One really doesn't have to go looking, sadly, for examples of overt racism. This was an article I saw on MSN, which is Microsoft, kind of just everyday news that lots of people would be clicking on if they're on their browsers on the computer. A black surfer, father and husband, was subjected to racially motivated vandalism and a symbolic lynching of his surfboard, pictured right there, nailed to a tree, reminiscent in the most horrific manner of the lynchings in the South. This was in Florida, Jupiter Beach in the United States just a few weeks ago. That's him. He's a very proud surfer. The claim from those who vilified him is that he wasn't following surfing etiquette. Well, the last time someone breached etiquette, I hadn't noticed that their surfboard would be nailed to a tree in that manner. So it may not be a justified kind of rationale that the individuals, the perpetrators, were offering. Daria Kazatskina, pictured there, she's a Russian tennis player, obviously complicated playing tennis in, not only complicated playing tennis for Russia in the current period, but there's actually a start to this quote was, "It's a war," and it's not regarding Ukraine, but regarding what she goes on to say, "The laws are getting worse and worse. I realize to be a gay person in Russia, it's becoming impossible." Now, she may have the flexibility not to live in Russia anymore, even though she hails from there and is pretty close to a top 10 women's player. She also asked, I think it was last year, if she could play under the pride flag, basically, the gay pride, LGBT plus whatever flag. So interesting how minorities, still have to fight in many contexts. The one is, the most advanced democracy, arguably, in the world, the United States. The other is a country that may be something of a pariah worldwide at the moment. Although I noticed the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has some very flattering things to say about Mr. Putin, but everyone has their view. So continuing, there are sadly, again, endless examples of women being disadvantaged, discriminated against, and worse, persecuted, marginalized, all the rest of it. This is not suggesting that it's justified to invade countries because they don't treat certain groups particularly well. But the reality is, after those military activities, after the occupation of Afghanistan ended, the Taliban have made head-to-toe clothing mandatory, decreed that women can't travel without a male relative. Women have been banned from secondary schools, universities, all sorts of jobs, libraries, public parks, gyms, etc. Families are reportedly forcing more girls into early marriages because they cannot get an education or a job. So we can localize those examples to Australia or wherever else. They'll be less extreme. but the importance of humanism and the set of values which we espouse to women's rights is patently clear. There is much work to be done, as they say. Humanism matters. I'm going to go back to Professor Grayling and then try and finish off. So humanism starts from the fact that human beings exist in an entirely natural universe, which is governed by natural laws. Humanism is to draw the best from and make the best of human life in the span of a human lifetime in the real world. So it's all very practical. It's all very here and now. I'll explain in the next few minutes sort of why I wanted to draw together what humanism is and why it matters in moving towards conclusions. Mr. Mandela there, I've got him covered up, so I just need to uncover him. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Okay, so with that leading humanist, he didn't make it onto A.C. Grayling's one-page list, but I'm sure he'd be on many people's top 10 list. This again is my summary in a sense of perhaps the single principle. One simple principle of humanism is that human beings are of equal moral worth and hence deserve equal dignity, freedom, respect, and opportunity in society. So that's kind of my rendering of what humanism stands for as a philosophy and as a broader social movement, and hopefully would be seen to also echo what Nelson Mandela is saying there. It's not just about freedom for oneself, it's enhancing the freedom of others. Now, the various campaigns which Humanist Victoria and other organizations follow or have followed historically include abortion rights, human rights more broadly, abolition of the death penalty, voluntary assisted dying, legislative reforms, secular marriage celebrants rather than having to be a religious ceremony, marriage equality, also known as same-sex marriage, which passed in Australia in 2017, climate change and environment, Indigenous voice, which we've spoken about, and justice and Indigenous rights more broadly. It could be along the list, but it's really an impressively long list of campaign contributions and ongoing, insights, let's say, to the morally preferable and more fulfilling future for human beings in general. Okay, I won't spend time in terms of references. We can come back to some of those afterwards. Moral pluralism, by which I mean there are many different ways of seeing what's valuable in life, and individuals will tend to choose that for themselves. So humanism, like secularism, which doesn't want to define what the good is at a societal level, which religion generally tends to do, and liberalism, which is the foundation of democratic systems of government, all accept the facts of moral pluralism. And Richard Holloway, who I'm happy to talk about in questions if you would like to, makes the point that life is manifold in the forms it takes. It is gloriously and inescapably plural. There's many different ways to live a good life, as long as one doesn't harm others. The freedom to do so in the light of one's own insights, tradition, desires is what humanism most definitely supports. Humanism embraces social needs and the co-development, one could say, of a shared human morality. And Tim Dean, who's an Australian philosopher, wrote this book just a couple of years ago, How We Became Human, which deals with how we, human beings, humanists, significantly among them, have forged morality not being something that's handed down from on high, but something that we have evolved because we are what he refers to as pro-social, which is very social or extraordinarily social creatures who have mutual needs, codependencies on each other, both kind of in physical survival terms, but also in terms of our well-being and thriving. So I did promise to come back to these 3 points. I won't go through them again, but just to remind us that it's a personal or individual philosophy of life that humanism can offer. It's a set of shared social values, which we can enlist, and we have been able to enlist a lot of support for, both the humanist movement, secular ethics, and the liberal projects of several hundred years in many countries, and also the political aspirations. So all of those layers hopefully fit together quite nicely. And to illustrate that, because I didn't have other things I needed to do at whatever time last night. So here, without further ado, is the diagram which brings it all together. Okay, now if you can make sense of that in 30 seconds, then kudos to you. Okay, but pretty much what's happening is at the bedrock, we have a naturalist philosophy of life, because individuals need to hold views or beliefs or ideals based on reason, because that's a clear value for humanism. So I've just added in there secular humanism, but generally simply known as humanism. On the right, we have religious humanism. I think it's a big project, improving life for human beings in one country or globally. So we need partners. And I know humanist organizations most definitely do partner. And I think regardless of different foundational beliefs, humanists holding a naturalist view and religious humanists holding supernatural beliefs, regardless of those, metaphysical, let's call them, or kind of ideational differences in terms of beliefs, the pyramid basically can be built together. And I've borrowed history from the Renaissance effectively, which is civic humanism, which is often used as a historical term and suggested, I imagine others may well have done this too, that the shared social ethic which we're seeking to, to co-create, to enhance, to develop, to foster throughout society could be called civic humanism, characterized by actively engaged citizens and concern for the common good. And the values at the top, which you've pretty much seen before, freedom, equality, justice, fairness, social inclusion, are the political institutions basically which support human rights, social justice, and political inclusion. And I'm happy to end there. I would just mention that a small subset of Professor Grayling's reading list is what I personally have been through. I'm not giving you my entire library in the next couple of slides, but there is Professor Grayling himself, The God Argument. You can see the physical book if you like physical books. It's on my screen, but it's blurred. The Case Against Religion and For Humanism. I actually particularly like the second part of the book because I think that's the positive argument for humanism, which is fabulous. Thank you to Les Allen for pointing out some resources from Humanist UK. This is actually a published book called The Little Book of Humanism. It is suitably readable, written by Professor Alice Roberts and Andrew Copson. And while we're on the topic, you can go back a few hundred years and read On Liberty and the Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, if you wish. And there is, I suppose he probably still is an archbishop or some such, Richard Holloway, but I can tell you the story during questions afterwards if you like. But he wrote Godless Morality just over 20 years ago, keeping religion out of ethics, and it affected his future in the church movement. I think they may not have taken kindly to some of his even-handed views as to whether the ethic that was being pushed was, unquestionably, the voice from above. So anyway, that's his story. And there are many great books by Steven Pinker and others. I'm sure you've all got a suitable reading list, but happy to add a few more gems if you would like them. Thank you.